Okay. Now it's transmitting. Okay.
Now
Thank
you can. So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fatima. I am a semiotic, graduating from PUC, professor at University of Brasilia, and I will coordinate this afternoon section. I apologize because my English is not very good, but I speak Italy and eu compreendo bem italiano. So if I made any mistake, forgive me. This session is the session 4, Critical Lotman Meta-Languages in Contemporary Culture. The first person to the presentation is Remo Gramigna. Yes, Remo is academic research to date has focused on semiotics and culture studies, cognitive theory, and communication studies. He holds a PhD in semiotica. His doctoral thesis tackled the philosophical problem of the science in tandem with the deceptive forms and communication. His interests include strategies of lying and deceptions in human interactions, deceptions in science, distorted communication, manipulation, insincerities, and fakes. Now, she told me he was in Turin, and Remo, you have 30 minutes to do the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. I will share a PowerPoint. I hope you can see it.
Okay.
Yes, can you see it, please?
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
Thank you. I will start then. In chapter 11 of the book Unpredictable Mechanisms of Culture, Lotman quotes the writer Chuchev, who wrote, it is not given to us to know in advance how our word will be recalled. Well, the echo and the resonance of Lotman's words and his ideas have been heard, and they still resonate today. In the field of semiotics, as well as in the neighboring disciplines, such as history, cultural anthropology, literature, as well as the arts, the name of Yuri Mikhailovich Lotman is often linked with a host of different concepts. Indeed, he was a very prolific and eclectic scholar and was also always future-oriented. He was a scholar keen to bring forth a conceptual and theoretical novelty rather than a type of writer who strives towards the systematization of his own ideas or the repetition of his own intellectual achievements. There are, however, some hallmarks that became Lotman's unmistakable signature. The study of the artistic texts, the typology of cultures, the concepts of semiosphere and semiotic modeling systems, translation and untranslatability between semiotic languages, predictability and unpredictability in cultural processes, explosion, to mention but a few, are some of the linchpins of Lotman legacy. Revisiting Lotman's ideas today, as it is done in this wonderful seminar, and I take the opportunity to thank the organizers for this event, is not only a unique opportunity to pay tribute to such an outstanding thinker of the 21st century, but I believe it also takes on a very special meaning in the precise historical moment that the world dwells at this current time. Because humankind indeed lives and experiences a time of tremendous uncertainty, unpredictability, and turbulence unheard of up to now, Rethinking Lotman's ideas today is pivotal, as is critical inquiry and his ideas feedback into the analysis of the present. Indeed, this current time, which is made of accelerated social, cultural, political change, as the chronicle of this year and of last year has shown to the entire world through the dramatic experience of the COVID-19 pandemic first, as well as now through the conflict in Ukraine, it is a good illustration of what Lotman has termed as explosion. Lotman, indeed, described this particular historical moments of crisis as follows, and I quote, "Critical periods when one has reached the end of old paths, while new paths have yet to be determined." Thus, an inquiry based on the re-evaluation of Lotman's ideas not only is of utmost importance, but also it is very topical. The purpose of my presentation today is the following, that is, to make the case for the semiotics of the concepts of emptiness, possibility, and potentiality in Lotman's late writings. My goal, therefore, is to discuss the relationship between emptiness or empty spaces, taken as dynamic processes in culture and as a prerequisite for change. As a corollary to this, I shall also touch upon the concept of possibility in the frame of Lotman's later works, Culture and Explosion, and The Unpredictable Workings of Culture, and then tie the concept of possibility with that of emptiness. This said, I shall make, first of all, a short parenthesis. I want to clarify, in fact, from the outset, the question of sources that I have employed for this research. As it is well known, translations are not the same thing as the original texts themselves. Here I quote a passage from Umberto Eco, who says that, and I quote, "A translation is not a direct source. It is instead a prosthesis like dentures or a pair of glasses," end of quote. I am thus, in other words, very much aware of the philological limits of my research. In my case, as I'll be showing you, I could resort to and compare two different translations in two different languages, English and Italian, and therefore my point of view is rather a limited one. At the same time, however, I should also be reminded of Lotman's own principle of polyglottism in the context of culture. That is to say, the minimum requirement of at least two languages in order to reflect upon reality. As such, I believe that my endeavor is partially justified in that the principle of polyglottism, which is, by the way, the basis for semiotic dialogue and for translation, not only should be regarded as a hallmark of the semiotics of culture, but it could be applicable to our own work as researchers as well. The problem of sources, however, is even more important in relation to the subject treated in this presentation, the problem of emptiness and possibility, because, as I will be showing you, the paper I will draw on has never been published by Jury Lotman. Indeed, forced to stay in bed due to a debilitating illness, and yet still in the midst of his intellectual and creative activity that had never stopped, during the years that go from 1992 to 1993, Jury Lotman dictated to his former secretary, Dr. Tatiana Kuzovkina, a series of texts in oral form. These manuscripts were never published and remained unfinished drafts. These papers are currently stored at the archives of the universities of Tallinn and of Tartu in Estonia, where I taken my PhD. Among these manuscripts, there is one which is titled Emptiness as a Fundamental Problem, which was written in August 8th, 1993. The form in which the draft was written, like I said, an oral dictation, as well as the circumstances in which it was born during Lotman's illness, makes the interpretation of this text a rather challenging task. However, I believe it contains some valuable insights, and this is why I wanted to present it to you. As one can infer from the title, in this draft, Lotman draws attention to the significance of emptiness as a pivotal problem, both for the historian of culture and for the semiotician. In the foresaid essay, Emptiness as a Fundamental Problem, Lotman mainly articulates the thesis that in any field of knowledge, from the exact sciences to the humanities and the arts, the same possibility of dynamic creativity within the system is predicated upon the existence of empty spaces. Thus, one of the main arguments of the draft is the following. The existence of emptiness is the prerequisite for change and dynamism in any system and in any compartment of science, without which the system would be completely static. In a nutshell, for Lotman, emptiness is the essential precondition that makes dynamic change possible in semiotic systems. Now, I believe this point is worth pondering and deserves attention. Let us take for a minute a short detour in the realm of physics. Well, we could say that the image of the importance of matter over energy is a total fiction, as it is disproportionate to the importance that energy plays instead in the physical world. If we take a look at the major Nobel laureates in physics, well, they all agree that it is void, or rather emptiness, that acts upon matter, rather than matter itself. As the Italian Nobel laureate Carlo Rubbia pointed out, and I quote, "We are made of 95% of void in between the molecules we are made of." In other words, it is energy, or more precisely, the empty space that revolves around matter, which makes possible actions, change, interactions in the physical world. So, since a long time, quantum physics underscored that systems or structures without empty spaces actually don't exist. And therefore, without the existence of empty spaces, there would be no interaction altogether. This is a general principle that is applicable to physics, to biology, but also to philosophy, to mythology, to the arts, as well as to semiotics. And I close here the parenthesis. Now, in his draft, Emptiness as a Fundamental Problem, Lotman capitalizes on this point and makes the case that emptiness is key because it is a reserve of possible dynamic changes. Indeed, in his draft, Lotman writes that, and I quote, "Emptiness in space and time is the essential prerequisite to the idea of dynamism. A world completely full would be static." So Lotman is very sharp in tracing the idea of emptiness as a common denominator that can be found in several semiotic systems, as this idea indeed is found both in mythology and in science. Indeed, both mythology and science are predicated upon the idea of an empty space or an empty time, and only in virtue of this initial condition, the system can transform, can evolve, can move, and can change. Likewise, also the artistic creation starts from an initial point of an empty space. Now, this said, I would like to dwell on the terminology that Lotman used and trace it back to some of his earlier works. First of all, it is worth noting that Lotman conceives of the concept of emptiness in terms of reserve for possible dynamic processes. This is Lotman's own terms, and also as a prerequisite for the idea of dynamism to occur. So it is in plain sight that in this definition, the concept of emptiness is interlocked with the idea of possibility, potentiality, and dynamicity. However, if we do pay attention, although it is tackled in a different in different terms, the same problem resurfaces in the article on the semiosphere. We already said that emptiness is understood as a reserve for possible dynamic processes. In the famous article of 1984 on the semiosphere, Lotman uses the same terminology. Here, indeed, Lotman writes that, and I quote, "The structural unevenness of a semiotic space creates reserves for dynamic processes," end of quote. At the same time, the internal diversity of the semiosphere implicitly assumes its integrity. Thus, whilst in the article on the semiosphere, Lotman assigns the function of being a reserve for possible dynamic processes to the structural unevenness of the semiosphere, later on, he takes up the idea of emptiness to fulfill the same function. This parallelism in terminology between these two articles struck me. Is Lotman using the concept of emptiness as a sort of a more flexible concept in order to explain how dynamic processes occur in semiotic systems? I do believe that this point deserves some soul searching, and I will come back to this point at the end of the paper. To sum up what has been said so far, the concept of emptiness is intertwined with the notions of possibility and potentiality. Emptiness is envisaged as a reserve in the sense that it is something not yet utilized, realized, or fully expressed. Empty spaces are pockets filled with dormant possibilities, and yet without its existence, change and dynamism will not altogether be possible, as a world completely full would be motionless and completely still. Again, Lotman is very sharp, I believe, in pointing out that from the early conceptions of physics to modern biology, that of emptiness remains a fundamental question. And yet, what is exactly emptiness and how can it be defined? Lotman acknowledges this difficulty, that of pinning down with enough precision what can a definition of emptiness be. It seems to me, however, that there is an implicit assumption in Lotman's own manuscript that there are different ways of conceiving of emptiness, although it does not explicitly say so, and it does not make an explicit classification of types of emptiness or of vacuity. However, he does claim that it would be convenient to argue that the history of ideas is not a finite series of concepts, but rather it should be regarded as the descriptions of the representations of void. Both in science and religion, as well as in mythology, the creation of the world starts with filling in empty space. Many mystical traditions have their own understanding of what being empty means. Buddhism, for instance. But Lotman sees it as a common denominator of different areas and of various disciplines. He argues that both mythology and science, but also poetry and art, start from the idea of an empty space and an empty time that should be filled in. In a nutshell, this is the common denominator of any act of creation, of any creative dynamism. Thus, for Lotman, a model of the world presupposes a model of emptiness. For Lotman, this means that the general questions of science, so the questions usually asked in science, that is to say, of what the world is made of, or what the world is filled in with, should be completely flipped around. Another point of view would be the following, according to this draft. What is a universe that is not filled in with anything? What is an empty universe? This is important for science, claims Lotman, because emptiness becomes the basis for their reserve of science that has not yet been utilized. I now come to the different types of emptiness. There are, in my opinion, at least 3 of them that can be singled out. To start with, one way to tackle this concept would be to define it against the background of language, therefore as something that it is indescribable or inexpressible through the means of language. In fact, Lotman writes that, and I quote, emptiness is something that is indescribable through the means of language, end of quote. Now, in order to unpack this point, the first type, I will have to go back to Lotman's earlier works. We all know that the problem of change and of dynamism was pivotal for Lotman. It is well known that one of the linchpins of the semiotics of culture was the concern to explain how change occurs in cultural systems. Indeed, Lotman spent a great deal of time and energy in studying the dynamic processes in culture, namely those processes that, whilst foster change and novelty, allow for the maintenance of certain structural features within the system. If one reads carefully the book Culture and Explosion, it is apparent that Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 are somewhat set aside from the rest of the book. In Chapter 1, entitled Statement of the Problem, Lotman states from the outset that a key question is the relation between statics and dynamics. One of the keywords in this chapter is the so-called extra-semiotic reality, which is sometimes also called the external world. But what it is really, this extra-semiotic reality? It seems that this terminology at first glance is quite cryptic, or at least quite obscure. However, the relation between semiotic systems with the extra-semiotic reality, as well as the relation between static and dynamic, are key issues in this book, Culture and Explosion, as well as in the Lotmanian semiotics taken as a whole. We should take notice also that such problems are laid out at the beginning of the book in order to set the stage of culture and explosion. But what is then the extra semiotic, the extra systemic, and the external world? These terms, in my opinion, remain quite unclear. However, one way to dispel this unclarity is to frame this issue in terms of the relation between language and extra-linguistic reality. This seems to be the route Lotman follows, as he brings forth the caveat of language as a modeling system. Thus, Lotman frames the entire problem of the relation between semiotic and extra-semiotic in terms of the relation between language and extra-linguistic reality. This way, language is taken as a means to model the world, as a way to semiotize the extra-linguistic reality, which in turn becomes a repertoire of content for linguistic expressions. To be more accurate, the space that lies outside language, according to Lotman, is transformed in content that in turn can be expressed by means of language. This point may seem quite trivial, but I think it's important. And it is important because, first of all, it lays out the foundation for a semiotical understanding of dialogue, as you all know. Given that there exists a linguistic reality and an extra-linguistic reality, which are taken as primitives in Lotman thought, it follows that no single language is able to grasp the entirety of the external reality. On the contrary, it is only the sum of these languages that, taken as a whole, can fathom the external world. From this stance, it follows the necessity of having more than one language, in fact, at least two, in order to encapsulate and reflect this reality, which is the principle of polyglottism and dialogue. This said, however, there is one point that is immediately relevant for my presentation. In fact, not only Lotman, at the end of chapter 1 of Culture and Explosion, argues that the minimal unit of generating meaning is not one single language, but at least two, but it seems to give to the extra linguistic reality a certain value which cannot be overestimated. Indeed, if you pay attention, Lotman defines the extra linguistic reality as follows, and I quote, a potential possibility to appear as content in an heterogeneous set of expressions. Hence, the extra semiotic reality is a reservoir of possibilities, and it is also what is not yet expressed through language. The need for any semiotic systems to have its extra semiotic reality is predicated upon the fact that without it, there would be no dynamicity within the system. However, a point of criticism remains, and this has to do with the fact that the extra semiotic reality remains, in my opinion, a quite fuzzy concept. I will now move briefly to chapter 2 of Culture and Explosion, entitled A Monolingual System. If this is not enough to contend with, even when from the higher semiotic systems, Lotman shifts his attention to the communication model, in my opinion, his focus remains on what is left out from the common zone, so to speak, or on the glitches of the system and the so-called mismatches of communication. As we know, in this chapter, he criticizes and reformulates Jakobson's model of communication, shifting the focus from the identity of the speakers to the differences between them. Whilst Jakobson cared about the area of intersection between speaker A and speaker B, Lotman flips around the model and argues that, on the contrary, it is the aspects of the communication that are left out of the common zone. That is, the area of non-intersection between speaker A and speaker B that should be considered and makes the communication meaningful. Whilst the communication that occurs in the area of intersection between A and B is trivial, is predictable, and is tasteless, the communication outside the intersection is unpredictable and is rich of novelty. If we really pay attention, as in chapter 1, where the extra semiotic plays a role in bringing in new content for linguistic expressions, also here in chapter 2, what lies outside the boundaries of the area of intersection has greater potentiality and is valuable for communication. Although it may seem paradoxical, the incomprehension between the speakers, the incommunicability and the untranslatability between languages are the elements that should be regarded as valuable, as well as the understanding and the comprehension between the speakers. Here, Lotman does not bring in the concept of void or emptiness per se. It is apparent, however, that in these 2 chapters of Culture and Explosion, the whole idea of true meaning making is realized only through the intrusion of what lies outside language, what is dormant, what is potential, and what awaits to be part of language as content of expression. It seems to me that Lotman later thought is permeated with this idea. Yes.
Remo, your time is finishing.
How much time do I have left?
In true, you don't have more time, but 2 minutes to finish. Okay?
Sure. I want to.
Minutes, please. You can use 5 minutes, please.
Mm-hmm. I will move to the second type of emptiness briefly. Another way to describe emptiness would be to consider it as a result of destructive elements that interfere in a system. As Lotman pointed out, the idea of movement and dynamism is often intertwined with the idea of destruction. Not only then the concept of emptiness is the prerequisite for the idea of dynamism, but the idea of change and development are interlocked with the process of destruction, which in turn is nothing but the generation of new emptiness. This paves the way to very important ramifications in the area of the Tartu Moscow School, which has to do with the deletion of text, with the erosion of texts, and with the destruction of texts, of which Professor Maria Lorusso has dealt a lot in the past years. The last type of emptiness is what I refer to as emptiness as unrealized possibilities. I'll move to the next slide. As pronounced in the introduction, the idea of emptiness ties very well with the concept of possibility, the more so in light of Lotman's later book. Here, Lotman conceives of the future, seen from the standpoint of the present, as a fund of possibilities, and that is why the future is, by definition, undetermined. There is not one single future. Future is plural. There are many futures according to the different choices we make. When we consider how the course of events unfolds, we have the past, the present, and the future. However, before the future is realized, there is an array, what Lotman calls a cluster of unrealized possibilities that may or may not be actually realized and manifested. So a path not taken in this perspective remains pure potentiality an alternative that remains unrealized. And this has to do with the dynamics of the explosion and with the idea of unpredictability that Lotman refers to. The topic I have dealt in this presentation is by no means exhaustive or a conclusive argument. The purpose of this work was to offer some points for discussion and reflection on a theme, that of emptiness and potentiality, which I believe is important for an in-depth study of Lotman's ideas. Lotman's draft represents an original and unprecedented development of Lotman's theory on dynamic processes in semiotic systems. The topic discussed demonstrates without doubt the modernity of Lotman's thought, which somewhat anticipated the central role that physics and Oriental philosophy would play in the contemporary world. Unfortunately, these thoughts on this matter remained unfinished. This is, I believe, his legacy to future generations, hoping that they will treasure it. Thank you.
Thank you, Remo. Now I have give more information about this section. You have 50 minutes to ask it. And Anna asked us about the possibility of changing the order with Regiane, and Regiane agree. So have someone want to do a question to Remo now?
Maybe,
Questions to Remo?
we have.
Ekaterina have a question. She questioned, can we think emptiness as a cause? Do you understand? Remo? We have a question.
Your
Would you
mic
mind
is.
repeating the question, please? Can we
Can
think
you
emptiness
think-
as chaos? Okay.
Yes.
Yes, we can. Absolutely, we can. What I was trying to lay out when I brought in the idea of semiotic and extra semiotic in the earlier works of Lotman has to do a lot with chaos and order. So if you want to substitute the words semiotics and extra semiotics with chaos and order, that would do, in my opinion. If we go outside the realms of semiotics, think about cultural anthropology or cultural and politics, those terms are used. Also in cultural psychology, you may want to take a look at the works of Jordan Peterson, for instance, whose book, the last book, 12 Rules for Life, was all about the application of Jungian psychology to the concepts of chaos and order in order to make sense of how dynamisms occur in the cultural systems. So I would say yes.
Thank you. Ekaterina, it's okay to you?
Yeah.
Yes. One
Can
more
I do a
question?
question?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Remo, for this speech. Very, very rich, and I will have to think about in next hours, days. So thank you very much. Also because I didn't know this essay that you mentioned about emptiness by Lotman. So really thanks. But I have a question that maybe sounds a bit provocative, but it is a real, honest question. If we think the emptiness as a reserve of possibilities, as a reserve of what is not yet expressed, what is not yet understandable. Why we have to call it emptiness? Because the emptiness, in my opinion, is something that doesn't exist. It's something where nothing exists. And it seems to me a bit in contradiction with the Lotman idea that we have always translation of translation of translation and different stages of adaptations and translation. So in the semiosphere, we don't have emptiness. We never had emptiness, isn't it?
Thanks. This gives me the chance to expound on what I was telling before. First of all, that is the reason why I enjoyed reading this draft by Lotman, because it gives a twist to the idea of emptiness as something, like you said, which has nothing in it. But I believe that nothingness and emptiness are not the one and the same thing. So this idea of emptiness as potentiality, or something that is not yet taken life, as for instance in the case of explosion and the paths not taken, it is somewhat, let's say, a fruitful way to understand how dynamic processes work. Now, if we take the semiosphere, in fact, like I showed in the slide, this word is not mentioned. However, it is mentioned the idea of the need for the semiosphere to have a reserve for possibility, which in that case is provided by the unevenness of the system. But the point which I was trying to convey is that if we do really pay attention in reading Lotman books, sometimes we have the feeling that he assigns a lot of values to what is external from the boundaries. In the case of the semiosphere, the edges and the boundaries of the semiosphere work as filters that let in novelty from the outside. So a way to rephrase in a more quantum physics-like way would be to call this empty pockets, dormant possibilities. So unfortunately, that remained a draft together with many other drafts left by Lotman, but it is revealing that he would have called that reserve and that potentiality empty spaces. So that's why I wanted to somewhat bring it in. Yeah. Thank you, though. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You have more two questions, but I think we have time only one. Regiane asked, how is it possible to realize the empty space? Would be after translation process?
Yes, one way would be through translation, and that would have to do with the first type of emptiness which I laid out. So if we consider this dichotomy between linguistic and extra-linguistic world, or between semiotic and extra-semiotic world, the act of translation would basically bring in content from outside to the inside that through translation would become content of a linguistic expressions. So absolutely yes, through the translation process would be one way to fill in those empty spaces. But Lotman has written so much on translations as such that probably we should refer to that as well. Is there any more comment or question?
Fatima, can I make a suggestion?
Because, yes.
Yeah, please. I think that is possible for him to answer the next question, because is an audience questions. I think that's important to consider. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Irene. So you have more a question of Arthur. Arthur asked, "Hi, Professor. Thanks for the letter. From your answer to Ekaterina's question, I ask about, but if we think of emptiness as chaos, and at the same time as something undescribable, yet to be described, is emptiness a matter of point of view? I mean, what is chaotic to system is order in the logic of the system.
Yes, thanks. I do not think that those two ways of conceiving of emptiness are contradictory. I would say those are complementary. And this is why. What is lying at the boundaries of the semiosphere, if we want to take this stance? Okay, so the extra semiotic space, it is something that has not yet entered through the filters of the boundaries in our, let's say, world, in our semiotic reality. So in a way, it is something that language or any other semiotic systems have not yet had the possibility to manifest, to describe, or to express. So this is why I kind of unpacked this first type of emptiness following Lotman's cue, that one way would be to consider those empty spaces as something not yet described through the means of language. So in a way, what is chaos, it is also something that has not yet taken form. It is something that is, let's say, not semiotic yet, in my understanding. So I see that it might, raise some doubts, but I would claim that those two typology, or those two ways of conceiving this concept, are not conflicting with each other, but they are rather complementary.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Remo. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Now, Anna